You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Good morning, Melissa. Good morning, Ramona. And good morning, Bernadette. Hello, my name is Mike Fraga, and I am your guide to a course called Immigration in the United States. Good morning, students, and good morning, cable audience. We have learned in this course that the U.S. federal government supports both corporate and business needs for inexpensive workers and high profits. Since its inception, the United States has maintained groups of rightless workers. In fact, one historian that writes about U.S. immigration and naturalization law shares with us that the United States is a nation by design. And so if we can understand the United States being a nation by design, we can understand that since its inception, the United States has maintained groups of rightless workers. Now, this course has viewed the historical experiences of the different directions of humanity: red, white, black, yellow, and brown. We have studied the experience of the immigrant as slaves, colonial subjects, racial and ethnic minorities, and undocumented workers. And the resounding theme throughout the study is that the federal government ensures people without rights for business. Again, a nation by design. The United States practices exclusionary citizenship. It began with indentured servants, then it moved to slavery. It is now called undocumented immigration, which is a contracted form of labor. We have witnessed disenfranchisement and dispossession of the immigrant worker sprinkled with white racism. The fear of the other, the fear of the immigrant, translates into policy that prevents people from achieving social justice and equality. Whites and Europeans were extended open immigration. They came as voluntary immigrants. Meanwhile, restricted immigration was created for everyone else. Africans endured enslavement. Asians experienced exclusion. Native people and Mexicans had to and have to deal with conquest. So let's see what happened this week so that we can appreciate the immigrant experience.
I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show by looking at a leaked FBI counterterrorism memo, which claims so-called black identity extremists pose a threat to law enforcement. That's according to Foreign Policy magazine, which obtained the document written by the FBI's Domestic Terrorism Analysis Unit. The memo was dated August 3rd, 2017, only days before the deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, where white supremacists, Ku Klux Klan members, neo-Nazis killed an anti-racist protester. Heather Heyer injured dozens more. But the report is not concerned with the violent threat of white supremacists. Instead, the memo reads, the FBI assesses it's very likely black identity extremist perceptions of police brutality against African Americans spurred an increase in premeditated retaliatory lethal violence against law enforcement and will very likely serve as justification for such violence, end quote. Civil liberties groups have slammed the FBI report, warning the black identity extremist designation threatens the rights of protesters with Black Lives Matter and other groups. Many have also compared the memo to the FBI's covert COINTELPRO program of the 50s through 70s, which targeted the civil rights movement. For more, we're going to San Francisco, California, where we're joined by Malkia Cyril. She's the co-founder and executive director of the Center for Media Justice, as well as a Black Lives Matter Bay Area activist. Malkia, welcome back to Democracy Now! Can you talk about this report and what your assessment is of this term they have used, black identity extremist?
Well, thanks for having me. You know, it's a great question. What is a black identity extremist? I think we're all trying to figure that out. Nobody knows, in part because it doesn't exist. It's a term fabricated by the FBI, constructed, and it has a history. I mean, for a very long time, for many decades in this country, probably centuries, the FBI has criminalized black dissent. We saw it through the COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, as you mentioned, in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. We're seeing it again today. This term, this idea of black extremism coming up by the FBI, being used as a way to criminalize democratically protected speech and activity. It's wrong, it's erroneous, and it should be withdrawn.
So what is your understanding of where it stands now?
You know, right now, we don't know. I mean, that's part of the problem. You know, we need some information from the FBI. It's clear that the FBI should provide an unredacted description. What do they mean by a black identity extremist? Right now, that description is pretty vague. It refers to some anti-white ideologies. It compares, you know, it talks about the ideologies of black separatism, but it doesn't have anything concrete. I mean, I think that's part of the problem, that this is a categorization that has been constructed. The definition makes no sense, and we need some more information from the FBI so that we can actually respond effectively to this categorization.
It doesn't refer to Black Lives Matter specifically. Can you talk about that, Malkia?
Well, I mean, you know, it doesn't refer to any specific organization because the FBI, through its own guidelines, can't really do that, number one. Number two, its guidelines say it can't start investigations or investigate anyone solely on the basis of race. So what it's done is it's constructed out of, you know, looking at 6 different cases over 3 years that have absolutely nothing to do with each other of people who have committed violence against police officers. They have constructed a relationship between these cases that doesn't exist, and then assigned some political ideology to those cases that doesn't exist. So anti-white feelings or sentiment doesn't lead to police violence. Being angry as a black person in America about the doesn't lead to violence against police. Being angry about police violence in America, police violence that is targeting largely people of color, also does not lead to violence against the police. So the bottom line here is that we have a rampant situation where white nationalism is on the rise. And yet the FBI has chosen to use its resources to construct and fabricate a threat that does not exist instead of addressing a threat that does exist. So whether it refers directly to Black Lives Matter as an organization or not, it's clear. This is an attempt to criminalize black dissent, which will have an outsized negative impact on those who are working in organizations like Black Lives Matter.
A federal judge in Hawaii blocked most of President Trump's latest version of a travel ban Tuesday, just hours before it was set to take effect. U.S. District Judge Derek Watson, who previously blocked plans by the administration to ban refugees and travelers from 6 majority Muslim nations, ruled the latest ban, quote, plainly discriminates based on nationality, unquote, in violation of the law, as well as the, quote, founding principles of the nation, unquote. The ban would have barred some travelers from Chad, Iran, Libya, North Korea, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. However, the Hawaiian judge, Watson's order, will allow a ban on some North Koreans and Venezuelans to go into effect. The Supreme Court was scheduled to hear arguments this month on an earlier version of a travel ban, but canceled the hearing after President Trump issued new restrictions. The White House has vowed to appeal the latest ruling. Earlier this month, Democracy Now! Spoke to Democratic Congressmember Nydia Velázquez of New York's 7th Congressional District, originally from Puerto Rico. She said she supports debt forgiveness.
Forget about public debt right now. The most important aspect and commitment from my end is to fight to get the resources that we need. If we don't make Puerto Rico whole, you're going to see a massive migration of people coming into the United States, and hedge funds or others who are owned money, they need to forget that Puerto Rico will be able to pay anything. If anything, we have to take care of retirees in Puerto Rico and the pension liabilities. I think that
should the debt be forgiven?
If there is a way, in terms of the authority of the federal government, yes, I will support it.
That was Congresswoman Nydia Velasquez talking to Democracy Now! Just a few days ago.
Si me siento de tus playas humorosas, si me alejo de tus palmas silenciosas, quiero volver a sentir.
Here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
Well, we continue our coverage of Puerto Rico 1 month after Hurricane Maria as we turn to longtime Puerto Rican independence activist Oscar Lopez Rivera, speaking last week in Puerto Rico. Until earlier this year, he'd been in federal prison for 35 years, much of the time in solitary confinement after he was convicted on federal charges of opposing U.S. authority over the island by force. President Obama commuted his sentence in January, and he was finally released in May.
This is Oscar Lopez Rivera in the neighborhood of Las Monjas in San Juan. He was busy visiting with community members affected by Hurricane Maria. He spoke with reporter Nicole Salazar while riding in the back of a van.
The overwhelming majority of Puerto Rico is completely alienated from the political structure. Colonialism is really strong and alive in Puerto Rico. And the politicians have taken full advantage of that. We have a debt of $74 billion caused primarily by the system and the political structure that exists in Puerto Rico. So for me, it has been a very devastating experience, primarily because one of the first things that I noticed was gentrification. We can anticipate that a lot of communities, including this one here, will be displaced once it is beautified, embellished, and probably gentrified. And this is very close to the ocean as a community with a lot of potential. And once they can wipe out the residents, then they can do whatever they feel like doing here. But we can see it in Ponce de Leon with Ciudadela, where we can see the buildings, where we can see the condominiums, we can see it by Ocean Park, we can see every part of Puerto Rico along the ocean, we can see gentrification taking place. And Vieques and Culebras are probably the biggest targets right now. So gentrification means the displacement of Puerto Rico, the displacement of the working class in Puerto Rico, and at the same time, foreigners coming into Puerto Rico, especially because the foreigners who invest in Puerto Rico are having access to incentives that we don't have access to. So if I buy a house tomorrow, I will have to pay taxes on my house, but if a multimillionaire buys a condominium for $1.5 million or $2 million, he will not have to pay any taxes for 25 or 30 years. So that's the difference in terms of advantages and disadvantages. And that's what the Puerto Rico that I have found, a Puerto Rico with a very high unemployment rate, and a Puerto Rican that seems to be in a desperate state, especially after the hurricane.
In a moment of crisis like this, a lot of times you see the financial sector moving in, people taking advantage. What are your sort of main concerns right now, given the sort of desperate situation Puerto Rico is in?
Well, the financial institutions are going to move in. You know, they will invest, they will buy out because the property is real cheap right now. A lot of Puerto Ricans are moving out. I am surprised at the number of Puerto Ricans that are moving out of Puerto Rico still. I thought that by now the immigration of Puerto Ricans had decreased a little bit, but no, you know, with the hurricane, it has increased even more. So I see the financial institutions, especially the hedge funds, moving into Puerto Rico with all the force, knowing that their investments towards the future are going to be multiplied or probably elevated to quantities beyond any notion of how capital works.
Can you respond to Donald Trump and the U.S. sort of response to the island, the political response?
I think that is reflective of the colonizer and how the colonizer treats the colonized. He has no sense of respect for Puerto Rico. He has demonstrated it clearly already by doing what he's done. It is shameful for me to see a president tossing things to people who are suffering so much as Puerto Ricans are. Besides that, the way that they came in with FEMA and Homeland Security really reflects what colonialism is to Puerto Ricans.
President Trump's latest attempt to bar some citizens of 8 countries from entering the U.S. has suffered a second federal court defeat. On Wednesday, U.S. District Judge Theodore Chuang of Maryland ruled Trump's own words helped convince the judge that the latest policy is, quote, an inextricable reanimation of the twice-enjoined Muslim ban and is likely to be found unconstitutional. This comes after a federal judge in Hawaii blocked most of the latest version of a travel ban on Tuesday, just hours before it was set to take effect. U.S. District Judge Derek Watson had previously blocked plans by the administration to ban refugees and travelers from 6 Muslim-majority nations. This week, he ruled the latest ban, quote, plainly discriminates based on nationality in violation of the law as well as, quote, the founding principles of this nation.
The revised ban removes Sudan from the original list and added the countries of Chad and North Korea and some government officials from Venezuela. The new order also includes restrictions on citizens from Iraq as well as all citizens of Iran, Libya, Syria, Yemen, and Somalia. Both the Maryland and Hawaii orders will allow a ban on some North Koreans and Venezuelans to go into effect. The Supreme Court was scheduled to hear arguments this month on an earlier version of a travel ban, but canceled the hearing after Trump issued new restrictions. The White House has vowed to appeal the latest ruling. For more, we're joined by Bahar Azmi, who is legal director of the Center for Constitutional Rights. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Bahar. Explain what just took place. Maryland court ruling after the Hawaii judge ruled.
Yes, so this is the third iteration of the Muslim ban, which attempts to clothe the previous versions that were just very facially, obviously directed at nationality with some legal pretense. The previous version simply banned all individuals from these 8 countries. This version had a purportedly neutral rationale. That is, these are countries who share insufficient security information with the United States. But these 2 courts saw through that rationale and agreed that the threat of discrimination from the first to the second to the third is still intact.
Well, let's go to Attorney General Jeff Sessions speaking on Wednesday. He defended this third travel ban of the Trump administration.
The Department of Justice is resolutely focused on dealing with the terrorism threats that we face. They are real. The military tells us they can expect not a reduction after ISIS is defeated, but maybe even an increase in attacks. The President's executive order is an important step to ensuring that we know who is coming into our country. It's a lawful, necessary, and order that we are proud to defend. And indeed, most may not know, the Supreme Court has already vacated one court's injunction against that order, and we're confident will prevail as time goes by in the Supreme Court.
So that's Attorney General Jeff Sessions speaking Wednesday in defense of this ban.
Yeah, I mean, it's as if, imagine Orville Faubus, the segregationist governor of Alabama, bans all black applicants to the University of Arkansas, and then that gets struck down by the courts, and he next decides to ban all applicants from 10 high schools to the University of Arkansas. 9 of them happen to be all black high schools. No court would accept that as reasonable or non-discriminatory, and that's what we have in the case of this latest version of the Muslim ban.
So explain what happens now with these 2 federal courts, one in Hawaii, and I couldn't help think about Hawaii being one of the judges that struck down the ban because of what Jeff Sessions famously said on a right-wing radio show. How is it possible that a man on an island in the Pacific can stop the President of the United States?
Yeah, which speaks to the general insufficient regard that Jeff Sessions and the Trump administration have for democracy and constitutional principles. So no doubt the government will attempt to appeal these injunctions, but the courts of appeals in governing both of these district courts have previously upheld the prior injunctions. So they probably won't have much success in the Court of Appeals and will ultimately seek review in the Supreme Court.
But the justification, of course, that the Department of Justice has given is that the countries now listed on the ban are listed because an extensive intelligence sharing evaluation that the U.S. undertook in all of these different countries concluded that these countries don't have sufficient restrictions in place, and that's why the countries were selected. So, in fact, it has nothing to do with Muslims or anybody else.
Yeah, that's the justification, but I think it speaks to the lack of credibility that this administration has. I mean, had this been enacted by the Bush administration or the Clinton administration, given the traditional deference courts give to executive branch officials in the context of immigration, you'd expect courts would step back. But this is just utterly implausible as a national security justification, given the way it simply reanimates the prior obvious discriminatory actions the government took, and given the sort of lack of a sufficient national security rationale once you scratch below the surface. I mean, we already investigate these countries. It's not like there aren't national security protocols in place when someone applies for a student visa from Iran. So it's simply a reanimation and speaks to the lack of credibility that this administration has in the realm of constitutional law.
Here in California, catastrophic wildfires have killed at least 42 people and left thousands of homes and businesses in ruins. The fires are still burning across multiple counties near where we are broadcasting from. We're in Marin, close to Sonoma County, which some say has taken the brunt of the destruction and is home to about 20,000 undocumented immigrants who've had little sanctuary from the fires. Last week, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, known as ICE, announced it would suspend non-criminal enforcement at shelters and evacuation centers here. But fear of deportation led some undocumented residents to set up camps on the beach or sleep in their cars, churches, or other pop-up shelters in order to avoid federal agents. Some evacuees also face challenges returning to their homes because of police checkpoints. CAL FIRE is investigating the cause of the fires. Residents in Santa Rosa have sued the Pacific Gas and Electric Company, claiming the company's failure to maintain its power lines sparked the blazes. The night the fires began, there were multiple reports of downed power lines and exploding electrical transformers. This comes as far-right media outlets like Breitbart falsely reported an undocumented immigrant was arrested in connection with starting the fire. Police say they did arrest 29-year-old Jesus Fabian Gonzalez, a homeless man who'd started a fire to keep warm. Deputies extinguished the small fire before any firefighters arrived. This was after the fires had begun. But on Tuesday, Sonoma County Sheriff Rob Giordano said there is, quote, no indication Gonzalez had anything to do with these fires, and it appears highly unlikely. On Wednesday, ICE's acting director, Thomas Holman, accused Sonoma County of being a, quote, non-cooperative jurisdiction that has left their community vulnerable to dangerous individuals and preventable crimes, unquote. The Sonoma County Sheriff issued a scathing response, calling ICE's statements inaccurate, inflammatory, and damaging, and said, quote, ICE attacked the sheriff's office in the midst of the largest natural disaster this county has ever experienced. I hope to end this senseless public confrontation with these facts so that I may focus on the fire recovery, he said. Meanwhile, the fires have also contributed to an affordable housing crisis, leaving thousands homeless in neighborhoods of California where rental prices were already sky high before the blazes. For more, we're joined by two guests who work closely with the immigrant community here. Juan Hernandez III is Executive Director of the La Luz Center in Sonoma, and Alegria de la Cruz is Chief Deputy County Counselor of Sonoma County, which is one of the main service providers for the large undocumented population. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Alegria de la Cruz, let's begin with you. You are the Chief Deputy County Counselor of Sonoma County.
That's correct.
But also you have been appointed to communicate with the Spanish-speaking population here.
So as Chief Deputy, I actually run an infrastructure group of about 11 lawyers who serve the county's departments that do important things like parks, water, roads, et cetera. And I've also been responsible for leading the county's efforts, coordinating the county's efforts with regard to immigration service provision, as well as fundraising for legal service, increasing capacity throughout the county.
Talk about what has just taken place. This attack it is reminiscent of Puerto Rico in the midst of their catastrophe. President Trump attacking the San Juan mayor, who you usually saw on television with water up to her chest, holding a bullhorn, trying to evacuate people safely. And he attacked her. Now you have the head of ICE attacking Sonoma County and the sheriff who is trying to deal with the fires.
It really calls into question the public safety issues that are raised by local governments in the face of such increased efforts in terms of immigration enforcement. 2 weeks ago, we, like others throughout the county, were training immigrant communities on how to protect themselves from immigration enforcement and warning people to make sure that before they open the doors to somebody in uniform that they saw a signed judicial warrant. And only 10, 11 days later, we're telling people, come on in for services, please, you're safe here. So the confusion and the conflict in people and in their emotional state, especially in light of this extreme natural disaster and the hundreds and thousands of people that have been impacted by this, is very difficult for the community to kind of switch so quickly. And so what we're seeing is tens of thousands of people not coming in to receive services to which they're entitled to, and continuing to seek service outside of the institutions that are designed to serve them.
Where did immigrants go? Juan Hernandez.
So we heard
undocumented.
Yes, we had a large report that a lot of them have went to the coast. Doran Beach was one location that.
So they go to the ocean.
Yes. And a lot of it has to do with just functional, right? It was cleaner air. They wanted to get out to get cleaner air. But I think that one of the key things that people need to understand is that communication was down completely. You could not use your cell phone. Internet was down. So communication in general was very hard to connect with people, English-speaking people, but even worse to the Spanish-speaking people. So they had no way of communicating with anybody. All they saw was the fires coming down the hill.
And people run to the beach because they're afraid to go to the evacuation centers. They're heading to water.
Yes. So what we saw was, again, the uncertainty of where to go. A lot of our families are disconnected from services. They're disconnected from media. They're disconnected. So the point is that they did the best they could to support their families.
So Alegria de la Cruz, when people would knock on the door, they're afraid to open it.
And this is in the face of a disaster where people are required and needing to evacuate in order to save their lives. So the county made a huge effort to ensure that information was provided in Spanish language, both written and as well as throughout the Spanish language media, really trying to send the message to folks that, okay, we've now shifted And now ICE has promised not to enforce immigration laws at these places of service provision. Please come. Please come and receive benefits for you and your family that you are legally entitled to. This is something that Sonoma County does on a regular basis as the largest service provider to the community. And so being able to kind of shift and make sure that we're continuing to do that in our capacity as the county service providers wasn't necessarily far-fetched from what it is that we do every day for people.
So respond to the head of ICE attacking your county, Sonoma County, where you are the chief deputy county counselor.
So my office does represent the sheriff's office, and I just want to kind of elevate his comments and to really highlight the fact that in the face of such disaster and such emergency, to then be responding to these kinds of attacks. I believe Sheriff Giordano said it beautifully, that these statements are inflammatory and incorrect, and making these kinds of statements at this time takes away all of the energy that we have to be fighting fires, which are still burning, making sure that people have services and are continuing to be safe. And in this time, it makes things very difficult to increase service provision to communities that are already vulnerable and in need of services, to continue to make efforts to make sure that people understand coming into shelters, coming into the local assistance center is safe, that we are there to make sure that people are receiving benefits that they need in order to recover, and that the recovery effort is equitable. These are not benefits that people are applying for illegally in any way. These are benefits to which families are legally entitled, and to be able to come into the center to receive this assistance is something that every Sonoma County resident who has been impacted by the fires has the ability and the right to do.
Can you comment on Breitbart News and others, but most importantly, the head of ICE, Holman, picking this up and accusing an undocumented immigrant of starting the fires? What is your understanding of what happened here?
The fires are still under investigation. The cause of the fires are still under investigation. It is premature at this stage, and it's very clear from the investigation that was conducted with Mr. Gonzalez's arrest that the fires could not have been caused by his small fire, which he was arrested for in the Valley of Sonoma just a few days ago, many days after the fires had already started.
Throughout the immigrant experience, we have seen how workers gain respect with employment, and everyone is committed to work when decently employed. So immigrant workers throughout history are following the logic of where wealth can be redistributed. And unions have always asked for decency in meeting subsistence needs. And every immigrant community that is now part of the American social fabric develops strategies to improve their immigrant community's struggle to survive. A sense of awareness and a commitment to immigrant rights and responsibilities have always been a part of the naturalization process. So last week we covered the tug-of-war between racial and cultural bigots and industrial lobbyists over what to do with the Mexican. Immigrants' labor struggles to achieve a decent wage during and after World War I was followed in the 1920s by a conservative reaction to progressive reform and socialist organizing. During the 1920s, the United States witnessed a rise of a narcissistic consumer culture in the midst of jazz, women's rights, prohibition, and government scandal. And we left off with events that led to the repatriation of Mexicans in increasing numbers, as they were the first to be blamed for the greatest economic meltdown the world had ever experienced. And this was a meltdown known as the Great Depression. So as the era came to a close, historians see that the maldistribution of income was a significant factor that contributed to the Great Depression. Many American businesses misrepresented their assets to obtain loans, and as a result, they were overburdened with debt. Now, the prevailing thought in 1929 concerning economic depressions was that economic downturns are natural and simply must be allowed to run their course. Whereas before downturns were related to overproduction, now underconsumption was caused by falling wages and rising unemployment. So that by 1929, many Americans could no longer buy the products they needed and wanted. The stock market crash of 1929, which marked the beginning of the Great Depression, came directly from wild speculation, which collapsed and brought the whole economy down. So the bubble of prosperity that was built on the mini-industrial revolution, where new industries consumer goods were built around consumer goods, that bubble burst. On October 1st, 1929, there occurred a massive fall in the stock market, which caused a run on the banks. Now, the boom of the mid-1920s, based on housing and automobiles, slowed. But despite the lack of demand, overproduction continued. Accountants manipulated the books, which led to an overspeculation in the stock market, driving the paper value of shares beyond their real value. So a spiral effect occurred in the market. If the automobile industry goes down, then steel demand goes down. Steel demand goes down, workers are laid off. Workers are laid off, then people do not buy consumer goods. And no protections were built into the economy. Economic historian John Kenneth Galbraith argues that speculation led to the crisis due to lack of regulation, unhealthy corporate and banking structures, unsound foreign trade, much economic misinformation, and the bad distribution of income, where the highest 5% of the population received about 1/3 of all personal income. This sounds familiar. But capitalism was in a crisis. And after the crash, the economy was stunned. It was barely moving. Over 5,000 banks closed, and the huge numbers of businesses unable to get money closed too. And those that continued laid off employees and cut wages of those who remained. And they did it again and again. So all over America, haphazardly created neighborhoods of shacks were built on garbage dumps. And they were called Hoovervilles. And Herbert Hoover and the Republican program did not reach out to the majority of the suffering poor. In fact, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation under the Hoover administration was really designed to bail out his political patrons at the outset. It did nothing to alleviate the plight of the workers. There were millions of tons of food around, but it was not profitable to transport it, to sell it, so it rotted. And again, if you notice my shirt, it says capitalism. When we try to understand something about capitalism, we can recognize the illogic, the sense of the emphasis on making money instead of the human condition. So you can imagine if you have millions of tons of food around, but it's not profitable to transport it. It's not profitable to sell it. So the food just stays in the fields and rots. You might have people who are hungry, but they can't go into the fields to feed themselves. You might have warehouses full of clothing, but people who can't afford it to keep warm, they freeze to death. So clothing is not redistributed. There's housing, lots of houses, but they stayed empty because people could not pay the rent. They had been evicted, and now they lived in shacks in quickly formed Hoovervilles built on garbage dumps. Last week I shared with you a clip. Let's go back to this clip and let's appreciate again the significance of Hoovervilles.
Millions of American workers lost their jobs. 1 out of every 4 workers was jobless. Only a handful of wealthy investors profited from the collapse of the stock market, like President John F. Kennedy's father, Joseph P. Kennedy, or brilliant investor and presidential advisor Bernard Baruch, who became legendary as the man who sold out before the crash. Performer and humorist Will Rogers probably put it best.
10 men in our country could buy the whole world, and 10 million can't buy enough to eat.
So the millions of less fortunate Americans faced a grim and uncertain future. Soup kitchens and bread lines became as commonplace as the flappers and speakeasies of the Roaring '20s. And Herbert Hoover's campaign promise of a chicken in every pot couldn't have been farther from the truth. America's towns and cities struggled in vain to help the thousands in need. The jobless became the homeless. Shanty towns, makeshift communities of shacks constructed from wooden crates, tar paper, and cardboard sprang up. Disillusioned citizens called them Hoovervilles after the president, and the newspapers they slept under, Hoover blankets. Others left the city to ride the rails, looking for work. Too poor to purchase train tickets, they hitched rides on freight cars, hoping they wouldn't be caught, hoping they'd find a job. Approximately 2 million men became hobos, wandering the countryside looking for work. Between 1929 and 1932, roughly 400,000 farms were foreclosed when farmers couldn't pay their mortgages and banks repossessed the property. Thousands of farm families became migrant workers, following crop harvests to eke out a living. Then, to make matters even worse, drought, coupled with the overproduction of crops in the Great Plains, turned the area from Texas to Oklahoma into a dust bowl. In 1934, strong winds blew tons of dust from the plains all the way to the East Coast. Dust even coated New York City and settled on ships 500 miles out to sea in the Atlantic Ocean. Unemployment and poverty hurt everyone, especially children. Many left school to work and help their families survive, and many more went hungry and malnourished. Diet-related illnesses like rickets and scoliosis became all too common. Once again, President Hoover tried to reassure the nation by saying, "Recovery is just around the corner." But it was not to be, and more Americans grew disenchanted with his policies and administration. Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon echoed the beliefs of most of Hoover's advisors, that the economy would recover on its own. Hoover thought the government must take some action, but feared making government too strong, and so he chose a conservative approach, calling together business, banking, and labor leaders and urging them to work together and avoid laying off workers or calling strikes. Then he authorized the expenditure of federal funds for large public works projects, like Boulder Dam, later renamed Hoover Dam, to create jobs and wages for thousands of workers. Hoover felt giving direct help to needy Americans would undermine their self-respect and looked to private charities to help the hungry. Instead, he approved more than $2 billion in emergency financing to businesses, hoping their renewed success would trickle down to the people who needed assistance. It didn't. Rather, unemployment rose even higher, and Americans were caught in a web of despair.
All right, crew, let's see if you can get my shirt this time for students to see. I don't know which camera. Should I go into this camera over here? Yes, there we go. There we go. You see there, capitalism, in this particular case, capital isn't. Let's appreciate something about the Great Depression. And again, this is the struggle that what we're seeing is the second generation of immigrants that have been coming into the United States. Now they're coming of age in the 1930s, and then now they're struggling to survive. And let's understand something about the immigrant who gave up his life to fight in World War I for the United States, because as the Great Depression evolved, the anger of the veteran of the First World War, now without work, his family hungry, led to what eventually is going to be called by historians the March of the Bonus Army to Washington. And they did that in the spring and summer of 1932. World War I veterans migrated to Washington, D.C. from all over the country to demand redress. So we're going to visit a documentary that is entitled The March of the Bonus Army, that's sponsored by the Disabled American Veterans. Let's go to the documentary.
America was not prepared when it entered World War I in 1917. Fighting the Germans required young American men by the millions, and the only way to get them was through conscription.
The American Army, for the first time in its history, will be composed of a majority of conscripted troops. And when the draft is explained to the American people, it's called selective service.
Some men were selected to fight, others to work in needed defense industries, or as farmers.
So it's a different conception of military service as work, as opposed to it's just simply a civic duty.
The first American troops arrived in France in June of 1917. In just 18 months, nearly 100,000 lost their lives. 200,000 more were wounded or gassed. Also, over there, were hundreds of thousands of African American soldiers. Barred from combat with American units, many fought courageously under the French flag.
For the first time, many of these people experienced what it was like to be treated as fully human beings by white people.
When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, most of the Americans that had served would never be the same. As the first waves of troops returned from Europe, the nation turned out to honor them with parades. But veterans quickly realized the high price they had paid.
Let's say a guy didn't go to war, stayed home, worked in an arms factory. He would probably get maybe 10 times as much as a soldier would. Soldier in combat was getting about $1.25 a day.
Soon after the war, veterans began to argue that soldiers should be compensated for the wages they lost while serving their country.
They very carefully used the terms adjusted compensation to be clear that what they are asking for is not a bonus, they are asking for back wages that are due to them. It was the detractors who called it a bonus.
Finally, in 1924, Congress granted World War I veterans adjusted universal compensation.
A law had granted them the bonus, equivalent to $1 to $1.25 a day for every day they served, which in many cases would be $600, $800, $1,000.
But there was a catch.
They don't get a nickel of the money until 1945, unless they die. That's what they call it, the tombstone bonus.
In 1928, Herbert Clark Hoover, a self-made millionaire, was elected president. In his inaugural address, Hoover proclaimed that the future of the country was bright with hope. Just 7 months later, the stock market collapsed and the country descended into the Great Depression. In America, in 1932, hunger and desperation stalked the land. 25% of workers were unemployed, and many were veterans. One of them was Walter W. Waters, down on his luck in Portland, Oregon.
He had been a sergeant in the war, and that's an indication that you were a pretty good soldier. And there were a lot of veterans sitting around trying to find what to do next.
Then came a ray of hope. A bill calling for an immediate cash payment of the veterans' bonus was introduced in Congress. Waters became obsessed with it.
During this time, I was anxiously watching reports in the newspapers of the progress of bonus legislation. And I noticed that the highly organized lobbies in Washington were producing results regardless of the justice or injustice of the demand.
At a meeting of jobless veterans, Waters stood up and urged them to march on Washington.
And when that happened, it kind of clicked for these guys. Eventually, there were about 300 of them. And they go down to the railroad yard to hop freights. And they go all the way across the country to Washington.
Once I built a railroad, I made it run.
They called themselves the Bonus Expeditionary Force, or BEF, a play on the American Expeditionary Force, the collective name for the troops sent to France. But soon, they were simply known as the Bonus Army. They carried knapsacks, or duffel bags, or bedrolls, with tin cups dangling. They had $30 among them. Meanwhile, word of the BEF was spreading. Even as Waters and his men were heading towards the Capitol, 25 vets from Tennessee were circling the White House in a truck bearing the sign, "We want our bonus."
And they start from everywhere. They start from Los Angeles. They start from Las Vegas. They start from Mississippi and Texas. They come from everywhere.
Antonio Oliver, a veteran gassed in the Argonne Forest in France, drove from Pennsylvania with his twin sons, Nick and Joe.
My dad got word to march on Washington and dump the tub for the bonus that they promised the veterans in 1924. And I think it was approaching dawn when he got there. and my father woke us up and says, "There's a Capitol building." I never forgot that.
Okay. As the film clip reveals, war veterans holding government bonus certificates, which were due in 1945, years into the future, demanded Congress pay them off now when the money was desperately needed. And as historian Jennifer Keene emphasizes, it was called selective service. And what they wanted, and she insisted, and she understands what the soldiers insisted, was adjusted compensation. It was not a bonus. They wanted to be paid for their service. And so they began to migrate to Washington from all over the country with their families or alone. And they came in broken down old autos, they stole rides on freight trains, or they hitchhiked. And historian Howard Zinn writes that they were immigrant miners from West Virginia, sheet metal workers from Columbus, Georgia, and unemployed immigrant Polish veterans from Chicago. And more than 20,000 came. And John Dos Passos described their encampment across the Potomac River from the Capitol in a place called Anacostia Flats. He wrote that the men are sleeping in little lean-tos built out of old newspapers, cardboard boxes, packing crates, bits of tin or tar paper roofing, every kind of cockeyed makeshift shelter from the rain scraped together out of the city dump. And the bill to pay off on the bonus passed the House, but is going to be defeated in the Republican Senate. And then President Herbert Hoover ordered the Army to evict them. So clearly, capitalism is capital isn't. Let's go back to the documentary and see what happened to the Bonus Army.
While streams of bonus marchers headed toward the Capitol, Pelham Glassford, the new D.C. police chief, prepared for their invasion.
I had been aware from the first that the BEF was symbolic of the vast army of unemployed. Anything unfortunate that happened might easily precipitate widespread social disorder.
Pelham Glassford was a decorated brigadier general during World War I who commanded the loyalty of his men in a very personal way.
Glassford was really pleased in many ways that the veterans were coming to Washington. But he knew that the politicians were not sympathetic.
Officials were also concerned that a large number of African American veterans were mixed in with the marchers.
And the irony is that going back to the Great War, the African American troops were segregated from the white troops.
Also preparing for the Bonus Army was a prominent World War I veteran, General Douglas A. MacArthur.
The United States Army, through its Military Intelligence Division, remained greatly concerned about the possibility of revolution. The Army developed a plan to defend the United States Capitol in the case of civil insurrection. And they were talking about using tanks, machine guns, gas.
By the time the bonus marchers arrived in Washington, the Army was more than ready to deal with them. At the end of May 1932, nearly 10,000 bonus marchers occupied the nation's capital, and tens of thousands more were on their way. Police Chief Glassford realized he was on his own.
They followed their leaders in the childlike faith that their government would help them, just as they had responded during the war. Hence, I felt these veterans could not be treated like bums.
On June 4th, thousands of Washingtonians lined the streets to see what the Washington Post called the strangest military parade the Capitol had ever witnessed. The BEF was marching in full force. Within days, Walter Waters had a full-fledged lobbying operation underway.
The veterans frankly made a nuisance of themselves. A couple of veterans were always sitting in each representative's waiting rooms. The representatives were solicited outside the building as well.
The strategy quickly paid off. After just 2 weeks, the House of Representatives passed the bonus bill. The BEF had won a battle, but a greater one awaited them in the Senate. In a remote neighborhood of Washington known as Anacostia, an enormous tent and shack city rose from the mudflats. Here, the threadbare heroes of World War I formed their last great encampment.
We just drove in and we were ankle deep in mud. I never saw so much mud in my life.
American flags could be seen flying from every possible vantage point.
A city was laid out in Anacostia. The streets were named by states. There was a library in the center of it run by the Salvation Army. There was music day and night. There was gospel music, and there was blues music, and there was country music, and popular music. There are people who built beautiful little replicas of suburban homes. There were guys who were buried alive for money.
I well remember the veteran laying in a casket saying, hey, they treat us like we were dead people.
A popular form of entertainment in the camp was boxing.
I was the best boxer. I was. We boxed. Pass the hat. My dad would get a little irate if we didn't really punch each other out. And he'd throw up both of our arms. It was always a draw, always a draw, always a draw.
People across the country sympathized with the Bonus Marchers' plight. But to official Washington, they were just a sign of trouble on the horizon. One of the stories that went largely unreported was that the color line seemed to have vanished in the Bonus Army camps. Visitors were astonished to see black veterans and white veterans sharing billets, chores, and rations.
The military experience has the potential for transcending things like race. And for black veterans to be in company with white veterans was a revolutionary thing.
Roy Wilkins, an enterprising young reporter working for the NAACP, decided to visit and see for himself.
At Anacostia, there was no residential segregation. Recruits of any color were made welcome.
It was a big event in the part of the city that I lived in. They had groups of whites and Negroes that formed a unit because they were from the same state. That was not so usual for the city of Washington.
And there were lots of people, especially people in the military, who saw this as a very, very dangerous thing.
And right there was the tragedy of it all. Men can live, eat, play, and work together, be they black or white, just as the BEF demonstrated.
On June 17, 1932, thousands of bonus marchers assembled on Capitol Hill to maintain a vigil on the Senate, scheduled to vote on the bonus bill passed by the House. The shouts and songs of the veterans, "The Yanks are starving! The Yanks are starving!" could be heard in the Senate chamber as the heated debate went on. Late in the day, Waters delivered the result to his troops.
The Senate overwhelmingly defeated the bonus bill, and the men were extraordinarily disappointed. But fortunately, a newspaper reporter suggested to Waters that he ought to order the men to sing America. And they did. They all sang America, and they dispersed peacefully.
But Waters urged the marchers to remain in Washington.
I am not advising anybody to go home. We intend to maintain our army in Washington regardless of who goes home.
President Hoover and other people kept saying, why can't we drive them home? A lot of these people didn't have a home.
It was pretty clear to everybody that they could not remain. But no one knew how to get rid of them, and no one wanted violence.
On July 16th, the last day Congress was in session, Washington was on edge. Thousands of angry veterans surrounded the Capitol. Near midnight, the 72nd Congress adjourned. congressmen left through back doors and underground tunnels to avoid confrontations. The situation had come to a head. The president ordered the evacuation of the veterans from downtown Washington. By police count, there were still 11,698 marchers and their families in Washington. Midway between the White House and the Capitol stood a row of half-demolished buildings where hundreds of marchers were living. On the morning of July 28th, the wheels were in motion to evict them. Waters urged his men to cooperate. Then someone began to throw bricks at the police.
Glassford and several police officers run to the area. 2 cops are grabbed. 1 cop pulls out a gun and he fires. Another cop turns and he fires a shot.
1 veteran was dead and another lay dying.
Now there's been bloodshed. Now you bring in the troops.
When MacArthur moved his troops to the affected area, he knew exactly what he was going to do. And he adorned himself in his dress uniform along with his major aide, Dwight D. Eisenhower.
The force stepped off at 4:30 p.m. More than 200 cavalrymen spread out across Constitution and Pennsylvania avenues. Behind them came 400 infantrymen, followed up by tanks and armored vehicles.
I was about 7 years old at the time, and the troops were out on Pennsylvania Avenue. I was scared, and my dad kept saying, nothing's going to happen.
The cavalrymen, one of whom is Major Patton, have got their sabers out.
The soldiers donned gas masks and without warning began hurling gas grenades at the veterans. The troops advanced, some jabbing with bayonets.
Tear gas was just burning my face. I was trailing behind my dad and he kept hollering, come on boy, come on boy.
Marchers were choking from the gas, just like the battlefields in France.
And so they're being forced out of their shacks by smoke bombs and tear gas, hurled by the troops who have been called out by the President of the United States.
Chief Glassford stood by helplessly.
The veterans did not believe the country for which they had fought would ignore the plight into which the Depression had placed them. Many did not believe that United States troops would take the field against them.
By early evening, most of the marchers had been driven across a drawbridge that led to their main camp.
The president does not want MacArthur to cross the bridge, and MacArthur disregards the order. Eisenhower later says that he saw this happen. MacArthur says, I cannot bother with pieces of paper during a military operation. And so he crosses the bridge.
All through the camp were scenes of panic.
My dad says, let's get the hell out of here. The soldiers are going to kill us.
Then troops began to set fire to their wooden shacks. One reporter wrote, the blaze was so big it lit the whole sky. A nightmare come to life. The president looked out a window of the White House in the direction of the fire, then retired for the night.
And the roaring flames sound the death knell to the fantastic bonus army that ends so disastrously in the shadow of the capital of the United States of America.
Wow. Can you imagine World War II soldiers practicing on World War I veterans prior to defeating Hitler? 4 troops of cavalry, 4 companies of infantry, a machine gun squadron, and tanks were assembled to oust the bonus army. General Douglas MacArthur was in charge of the operations. Major Dwight Eisenhower, his aide, George Patton, one of the officers. So as the film clip revealed, MacArthur led his troops down Pennsylvania Avenue and used tear gas to clear the veterans out of old buildings and set the buildings on fire. Then MacArthur led the army across the bridge to Anacostia, and there the soldiers destroyed the entire encampment. So Washington was on fire, and it was all over. 2 veterans had been shot to death, and an 11-week-old baby had died, and an 8-year-old boy was blinded by gas. 2 police had fractured skulls, and 1,000 veterans were injured by the gas. So again, the hard times of the Depression and the inaction of the government to help the people became exacerbated by the dispersal of war veterans. And the majority of these war veterans were immigrants or children of immigrants. And in the election of November 1932, Democratic Party candidate Franklin Delano Roosevelt is going to defeat Herbert Hoover overwhelmingly, one of the most lopsided defeats in presidential elections. And when FDR took office, he began a program of reform legislation which became famous in what we know now as the New Deal. The Roosevelt reforms went far beyond previous legislation. And the New Deal had 2 pressing needs to meet: to reorganize capitalism in such a way so as to overcome the crisis and stabilize the system, and to head off the alarming growth of spontaneous rebellions that appeared in the organization of tenants and the unemployed, in the movements of self-help, and in the general strikes in several cities. So the years 1933 and 1934 were the most trying times for the Roosevelt administration. So the first objective of the Roosevelt administration was to stabilize the system. And this can be seen by the National Recovery Act, or eventually what became institutionalized as the National Industrial Recovery Act, or the NIRA. Now, the act was designed to take control of the economy through a series of codes agreed upon by management, labor, and the government. And basically what the NIRA did was it fixed prices and wages. It limited competition, and it ensured cooperation between capital and labor. And the act created codes for fair employment practices and fair competition. While the Supreme Court is going to rule the act unconstitutional in 1935, and the National Recovery Act is going to be replaced by the National Industrial Recovery Act, or known as the Wagner Act of 1935. Now, a very important provision in the act became a boon to organized labor, and that is Section 7A of the NIRA. Now, Section 7A of the act allowed workers to establish their own independent unions, whereas the Republican administrations of the 1920s created company unions. The New Deal outlawed company unions and prevented companies from interfering in the organization of unions. And it allowed for the formation of unions to be legal. And so this was very important. Section 7A of the National Industrial Recovery Act legitimized union activities. So, when Roosevelt took office, a rebellion engulfed numerous parts of the country. Desperate people were not waiting for the government to help them. And all over the country, people organized spontaneously to stop evictions. You can imagine being evicted from your home in New York, in Chicago, in all of the major cities. When word spread that someone was being evicted, a crowd would gather, the police would remove the furniture from the house, put it out on the street, and then the crowd would get the furniture and put it back into the house. And it was the Communist Party that was active in organizing what were known as workers' alliances in numerous cities. And it was the socialists who organized unemployed councils all over the country. So it was the Communist Party and the Socialist Party that were involved in helping people. And people organized to help themselves, since business and government, in the form of the Republican and Democratic Party, were not helping them. In fact, 1.5 million workers in different industries went on strike in 1934. Howard Zinn relates that during the spring and summer, longshoremen on the West Coast, from California to Washington, in a rank-and-file insurrection against their own union leadership, as well as against the shippers, held a convention, demanded the abolition of the shape-up. Now, what the shape-up is perhaps most of you have seen around your neighborhoods, is a kind of early morning slave market where gangs are chosen for the day, for the day's work. You can usually see these gangs around Home Depot. Well, they will go out on strike trying to eliminate this shapeup. And within days, 2,000 miles of Pacific coastline are going to be quickly tied up. And the Teamsters cooperated, refusing to truck cargo to the piers, and then the maritime workers joined the strike. So when the police moved in to open the piers, the strikers resisted en masse, and 2 are going to be killed by gunfire. And so San Francisco shut down. And so when we take a look at when the police moved in to open the piers, the strikers brought together tens of thousands of supporters. And then a general strike was called in San Francisco with 130,000 workers walking off their jobs. The city became immobilized. Let's take a look at what happened.
The summer of 1934 was a season of protest. New federal laws supported the right to join unions, and across America, a wave of strikes tested the New Deal's commitment to labor. In San Francisco, striking longshoremen had closed the port for 2 months. Violence erupted when police broke through strikers' picket lines. 2 men were killed, more than 70 injured. Within hours, California's governor, Frank Merriam, declared a state of emergency.
Forbearance with the striking longshoremen in San Francisco has passed the point of common sense and good citizenship. I have ordered the National Guard of California to move into San Francisco to safeguard life, to protect state property, and to preserve order.
Labor leaders believed that Merriam had called out the Guard to break the strike. In support of the longshoremen, more than 100,000 union workers walked off their jobs calling for a citywide general strike. San Francisco shut down. People began to hoard food. The Roosevelt administration was now torn between supporting or condemning the general strike. New Deal Administrator Hugh Johnson spoke for those who felt that labor had gone too far.
You are living out here under the stress of a general strike. Now the right of dissatisfied men to strike against a recalcitrant employer is inviolate. But the general strike is quite another matter. That is a threat to the community. That is a menace to government. That is civil war.
After 4 days, workers called off the general strike. Longshoremen and ship owners agreed to arbitration, and the city came back to life. For many, the strike was a warning of the power which the New Deal had placed in the hands of ordinary working people. And troops on the streets of San Francisco triggered fears that the country was on the brink of revolution.
In addition to riflemen,
Moviegoers across America saw alarming reports of the general strike.
also the police have organized the only mounted gas squad in the world. They've been ordered to round up the Reds, the radical agitators blamed for the virulence of the strike. They're out to comb the railroad yard, to rout out nests of communists hiding in empty boxcars. That gas will drive them into the open. Yep, there's a bunch of them now, dodging stinging gas clouds.
All right. Those darn communists, those darn socialists agitating. It took 500 special police, 4,500 National Guardsmen with infantry, machine guns, tanks, and artillery units to end the strike, again, by force. Now, you know, students, why conservatives in this country cry communist and socialist agitation at events that normal people like you and me participate in when seeking justice and economic equality. So get to know what the Red Scare is. Do not be afraid of social change and the development of consciousness. The people of San Francisco were not. In that same summer of 1934, Roosevelt had to deal with another major strike. And that was the strike of Teamsters in Minneapolis. In Minneapolis, the Teamsters were supported by other working people, and soon nothing was moving in the city except milk, ice, and coal trucks given exemption by the strikers. Farmers drove their products into town and sold them directly to the people in the city. The police attacked, 2 strikers were killed, and 50,000 people attended the mass funeral. There was an enormous protest meeting and a march on City Hall. And after a month, the employers gave in to the Teamsters' demands. But let's visit a documentary on the shutdown of Minneapolis.
Don't have jobs. They can't get unemployment benefits or other aid because this was before those government programs were created. Their attempts to organize have been met by police clubs. Hungry for work, they could be hired to replace workers who are on strike. The leaders of Local 574 know this and reach out to these workers, inviting them to form their own section of the union. Encouraged by the solidarity exhibited by the truckers, the unemployed workers sign up to serve as pickets instead of strikebreakers. The Teamsters in Minneapolis are inspired by the courage of workers in other cities who are also standing up for fairness and the right to join unions. In Toledo, Ohio, thousands of workers at an auto parts factory, half of them women, go out on strike with the full support of unemployed people in their community. In San Francisco, people fill the streets and shipping is stopped at every port on the West Coast when longshoremen go on strike to have a voice in the workplace. By mid-May, with their plans carefully mapped out, the now 6,000 members of Local 574 in Minneapolis vote to shut down the city. They demand better wages and union recognition. They also tell the employers that the union must include not only drivers, but all of the men and women working at the warehouses. The union uses a brilliant but risky tactic called the cruising picket line. Carloads of strikers cruise the downtown area looking for trucks that might be trying to move cargo in violation of the strike. When they spot one, the picketers stand in front of the truck with their signs. The tactic works well, and for several days, the truck traffic is nearly halted. This kind of operation requires a lot of support. Women work 12-hour shifts to feed thousands of strikers. Sympathetic small business people provide food for the strike kitchen.
Some of the milk companies sent in milk and gave us tickets so pickets could take milk home for their children.
Secretaries who support the strike listen in on their employers and give the union information regarding anti-strike plans. The workers are winning, but the employers have not given up. On May 21, 1934, strikers, police, and special deputies hired by the Citizens Alliance confront each other in hand-to-hand combat in the city's Central Market District. The conflict spills over into the next day when a local radio station broadcasts live from the site.
And the cops showed us how to swing clubs, and then the day before, and we learned fast over. We beat them back, and so they shut the gates finally.
Police and Citizens Alliance deputies flee the clubs of the pickets who soon control the streets. Injured police, deputies, and strikers lie bleeding on the cobblestones. 2 Citizens Alliance deputies die from the blows they receive. One of them, a prominent Minneapolis businessman. Desperate to put an end to the violence, Governor Floyd B. Olson urges the union and the Citizens Alliance to meet. After 3 days, an agreement is reached. The strikers will be reinstated to their jobs, and the employers agree to grant union recognition to a broad range of workers in the trucking industry. But the battle for Minneapolis, which now appears settled, has really only just begun. Soon, it becomes clear that the employers are not sticking to their side of the deal. The workers vote to strike again in mid-July. The union's newspaper, The Organizer, becomes the first daily paper ever published by a striking union. A strike committee of 100 is elected to represent the many different kinds of workers in the industry. They meet every morning and lay out their plans for the day. Many other unions come out in support of the strike. A special farmers market is set up so that small farmers can sell their food directly to the public, thus avoiding hardship from the strike.
We were fortunate to be in a state where there was an active farm holiday association. The farmers helped us tremendously. And they used to bring in food and supplies and milk in every way. And farmers that understand what it's all about realize that they're workers too, except they ain't got no 8 to 5 day. They start in the morning and they quit at night, and it's 7 days a week. But the farmers around the adjacent area to the Twin Cities were tremendous in their support and help in the 34 strike.
Pickets fan out from new headquarters in the heart of downtown. They keep the streets nearly free of truck movement. The mayor of Minneapolis urges Governor Olson to mobilize the National Guard in case of new outbreaks of violence. The Minneapolis police chief orders his forces to begin moving goods. On July 20th, Henry Ness is on picket duty for the union. He is riding on the back of a pickup with a dozen other strikers when a truck carrying merchandise pulls out from a warehouse near the market. The pickup in which Ness is riding moves quickly to intercept the truck. Standing by, a line of police are ready with their shotguns.
We heard the shooting. It was in the middle of the block. The truck would have tried to intercept the truck, I'm sure. That was the intent. But nobody got out of the truck, and the pictures will show police started to open fire on them. Harry and I and Ben Koski, and I remember Ben because we were all three injured, come out of that alley, and we ran into a policeman who was down on one knee, and he had a Sub-Thompson machine riot gun. And just as we come around the corner, he fired. And he knocked Harry DeBoer's leg. We didn't know how bad, but Harry fell down. Ben Koski's hand was right next to Harry's leg, and he pretty near severed it. And I got the balance of the charge, lacerations in the stomach area, and I got some cracked ribs out of it. I thought I was killed because I was bleeding, but it was just surface wounds, it turned out to be. We got Harry, got him up to the strike headquarters, we got Koski there, and everyone went to different hospitals.
All right, fascinating story again. The 1934 Minneapolis shutdown. We need to appreciate, students, what's going on here. Remember back the different generation prior to World War I, we saw socialist organizing influencing populist reform or progressive reform. Again, World War I pulled the rug from the socialists by incarcerating them, and it quieted progressive reform. So that the 1920s was a conservative era that led to this economic meltdown. And now we see socialist organizing, and it's influencing progressive reform. As we can see by these experiences, remember, conservatives in this country, anytime Americans attempt to organize for their rights, conservatives will cry out communism, will cry out socialist agitation. They need to be deported. But you can take a look at these peoples who are just normal like you and me. I don't think that they're communist. I don't think that they're socialist. I think that they're human beings, people like you and me participating in movements seeking justice and economic equality. So get to know what the Red Scare is all about. Do not be afraid of social change and the development of consciousness. Now, as we can see, Roosevelt and his administration, his advisors, and the businessmen who supported Roosevelt understood that measures had to be taken quickly to give jobs, provide relief, and regulate labor disputes. But it wasn't all of a sudden just because they thought that they are going to protect or they're going to think about the immigrant or the immigrant's children. The National Labor Relations Act, or what is known as the Wagner Act, after its sponsor, New York Senator Robert F. Wagner, is a 1935 United States federal law that limits the means with which employers may react to workers in the private sector who create labor unions, who are also known as trade unions. Now, this act is very important because the idea is to eliminate the violence, as we see in the 1934 strikes. And the idea is to force owners to engage in collective bargaining and to take part in strikes and other forms of concerted activity by the workers in support of their demands. President Roosevelt signed the legislation and law on July 5th, 1935. And this law defined and prohibited 5 unfair labor practices. And these prohibitions still exist, while others have been added under labor legislation or under later legislation. Now, the original employer unfair labor practices consisted of interfering with, restraining, or coercing employees in their rights under Section 7. And these rights include freedom of association, mutual aid or protection, self-organization, to form, join, or assist labor organizations, to bargain collectively for wages and working conditions through representatives of their own choosing, and to engage in other protected concerted activities with or without a union. So the Wagner Act is very important. It prohibits another practices from dominating or interfering with the formation or administration of any labor organization. It prohibits discriminating against employees to encourage or discourage acts of support for a labor organization. It prohibits discriminating against employees who falsify charges or testify. And it prohibits refusing to bargain collectively with the representatives of employers, employees. So big business obviously thought it was too helpful to labor, and they opposed it. Roosevelt was cool to it, but as we have seen by these labor outbursts, it suggested the need for legislative action. So again, we can see how socialist organizing influenced progressive reform. The previous immigrant generation, now the children of immigrants and the immigrants themselves, are going to ask the federal government, please support us. So in 1934 and 1935, hundreds of thousands of workers that were left out of the tightly controlled exclusive unions of the trades, known as the American Federation of Labor, they began organizing in the new mass production industries of auto, rubber, and the packing houses. And this new union is going to be a committee first. The AFL could no longer ignore them. And in 1935, the American Federation of Labor, there was a convention that the conservative leadership was challenged by David Dubinsky of the International Longshoremen and Warehousemen's Union, by John Lewis of the United Mine Workers, and Sidney Hillman of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers. And a resolution to organize the mass of industrial workers was defeated, and these 3 walked out and formed what will be known as the Committee for Industrial Organizations. It became known as the CIO. But at first it was just a committee. And the committee was set up to organize workers outside of craft lines. By industry, all workers in a plant belonged to one union. So this committee was very important. It began to address what immigrants and children of immigrants had been asking for in terms of a living wage. Now, as Howard Zinn describes in his epic volume of A People's History of the United States, it was the rank-and-file strikes and insurgencies that pushed the union leadership of the AFL and the CIO into action. Because a new kind of tactic began among the rubber workers in Akron, Ohio in the early 30s. It became known as the sit-down strike in Akron, Ohio. Now the workers, these were the children of immigrants' parents, they were immigrants themselves. What they did was they stayed inside the plant instead of walking out. And this had clear advantages. They were directly blocking the use of strikebreakers. They did not have to act through union officials, but were in direct control of the situation themselves. They did not have to walk outside in the cold rain, but had shelter. They were not isolated as in their work or in the picket line. There were thousands under one roof. They were free to talk to one another to form a community of struggle. And in early 1936, at the Firestone rubber plant in Akron, Ohio, makers of truck tires, their wages already too low to pay for food and rent, were faced with a wage cut. And when several union men were fired, others began to stop work to sit down on the job. Workers then at Goodyear followed suit. And this idea spread throughout 1936. And in December of 1936, The longest and the most famous sit-down strike of all began at Fisher Body Plant Number 1 in Flint, Michigan. It became known as the Flint's sit-down strike. Let's go to a documentary and find out what happened at the sit-down strike.
These were days when history changed its course. The sit-down strikes began on December 30th. They began with the attempt of GM to move the dies at Fisher Number 1 to Grand Rapids and elsewhere.
They have no idea what it was like to have to work along a line in the shop. It was hard work.
And then you didn't get no overtime. And if you worked it over, it was just your straight regular time. Of course, the women weren't allowed to work any overtime, but the men, they could work overtime, but wouldn't get no extra pay for it.
It was hot in the summer, cold in the winter. You couldn't always take time off if you needed to go to the bathroom. And I remember in 1936, before the strike, it was very, very hot. And down in the Chevrolet, there were people who were dropping over because of the heat. And the other workers were told, just step over them until we can get them out of the way. They didn't slow down the line, they didn't stop it, and they just dragged people away. It was terrible. And I think that's one thing that really helped bring on the strike.
On January the 4th, the union submitted a complete list of grievances. We asked for a national General Motors agreement, for day rates and the abolition of the hated piecework system, for seniority, for recognition of the union, for control of speed-up, for grievance procedures, for the reinstatement of all the men who had been fired for union activity, and for a 30-hour week. GM said no to everything. Widely separated workers, workers who didn't know each other, workers who didn't know each other's names, men who had been divided, weak and oppressed, came together in union and in solidarity.
The union spokesman was John L. Lewis. Reporters from all over the world converged on Flint. Flint, the General Motors factories where the workers were sitting in, had become a stage which the workers of the world, wherever they were watching intently. Extra editions of papers came out on Flint developments in Paris, in Rome, in London, Calcutta, Buenos Aires.
Well, the men stayed, but the women had to go out. We couldn't stay.
I remember my dad calling home a few weeks into the strike and saying to my mother, Ida, we're having trouble keeping some of these young fellows in here. They're threatening, their wives are threatening to divorce them, or they want them home, and the guys want to get home, naturally. And she said, Jay Green, if you come out, I will divorce you.
I know there's one guy that had 5 kids, and he got so nervous he passed out because he had 5 kids and he didn't know he was going to get a job or not, get a job back.
It was a bitter winter in January. Flint was the Valley Forge of the people who work in the plants. These were times when the summer soldiers fell away and the winter soldiers stood up in a terrible trial. Armchair generals and colonels were demanding that the National Guardsmen go into those plants and shoot the sit-downers out. But for once, the National Guard truly maintained law and order. The strikers were disciplined, but the Flint City government was the General Motors government after all, and General Motors insisted, so the police tried to evict the sit-downers. This is not vandalism you see there. They are breaking these windows to let the air in and to let the tear gas out. Of the Battle of Bull's Run, the attempt to end the sit-down strike in tear gas and blood as if it were a kind of 13th century peasants' revolt failed. There were casualties.
We didn't know what was going to happen. And then, of course, when the National Guard was called out, we were scared to death that they were going to maybe shoot down the workers, the strikers. But it didn't. We had a good governor, and he sent the National Guard in to protect them.
We will work our way out of this strike peacefully and without injustice to anyone. And I am confident that after it's all over with, there will be a better understanding between employer and employee. And better still, I hope that conditions will be improved under which men and women labor and live.
The sit-down strikes reached their climax at the beginning of February. Governor Murphy had been in office just 1 month. General Motors had tried everything, spies and intimidation. GM had taken its case to court before a judge who was a GM stockholder. The corporation had applied pressure on Governor Murphy. It had tried evicting the strikers by force. But not for a moment did the discipline of the strikers waver. Their wives and their children came to the factory windows. The troops, there to maintain order, not to shoot strikers, bivouacked in the streets.
The strike came to an end on February the 11th, 1937. Governor Murphy announced the settlement terms. For a period of 6 months, General Motors would not, without the governor's permission, deal with any employee spokesman except the UAW in the 17 plants that had been struck. In the other plants, the union would be dealt with as representative for its own members. No discrimination against union people. All strikers would be rehired. Union members could talk about the union during lunch and rest periods. All court proceedings against the union and its members to end. The company would begin to negotiate with the union in good faith. It was a magnificent and historic victory.
Well, it made a company give us a better feeling. And for black people, we got jobs that we didn't get before because most of the time we were just sweeping the floor. But after that, we all went on machines and everything.
People need a union. That's the main thing, because you can't survive too long without a union and really live a decent life. Kids just don't have any idea what it was like. But I'm afraid someday they're going to find out.
The people will have a union and hang on to it because you can't be without one. If you don't, you get somebody there whipping you, make you work there, and no representation, you know how it is. No representation, they take advantage of you.
General Motors workers in Flint get the news of the settlement, and the celebration is spontaneous. The flag tells you how the people feel. They have just won back one of their constitutional rights. Home is the sit-down. After the long, patient struggle in the factory, the men go home. What these people are celebrating deep into the night is the end of an impossible and unbearable subjection. Unions have brought wage earners so much security and freedom and dignity that it isn't easy even to recall the terrible oppression that came to an end with the winning of the sit-down strike.
Well, it made a middle class. We could have decent food. We could live in a decent place. We could wear decent clothes. We could relax, which we just couldn't before. We were always on edge, it seemed, that if you're hungry sometimes, that's not good. And I remember being hungry sometimes. People were able to buy homes, hold their heads high, have self-respect, which we didn't always have before.
Again, very important for this generation. What she said about self-respect, about having a home for the first time, about being relaxed and not being oppressed. And again, these are the children of immigrants and immigrants themselves who went out to make sure that social justice and economic equality could be had in the United States. So get to know the Red Scare, students. Don't be afraid of social change and the development of consciousness. And again, conservatives in this country do not like it when there is socialist agitation, because after all, the idea is about human rights and immigrant rights. Now, the sit-downs were especially dangerous to the system because they were not controlled by regular union leadership. And in Chicago, on Memorial Day of 1937, the strike at Republic Steel is going to bring out the police, and they're going to fire at a mass picket line of strikers, killing 10 of them. And the incident took place in what was called the Little Steel Strike. And today in labor history, it is known as the 1937 Memorial Day Massacre. The incident arose after U.S. Steel signed a union contract, but smaller steel manufacturers like Little Steel, including Republic Steel, refused to do so. And in protest, the Steel Workers Organizing Committee of the Congress of Industrial Organizations called a strike. So on Memorial Day, hundreds of sympathizers gathered at Sam's Place headquarters of the Steelworkers Organizing Committee. And as the crowd marched across the prairie towards the Republic Steel Mill, a line of Chicago policemen blocked their path. And when the foremost protesters argued their right to continue, a tree branch was tossed at the police lines and the police fired on the crowd. And as the crowd fled, police bullets killed 10 people and injured 30. 9 people were permanently disabled and another 28 had serious head injuries from police clubbings. No police were ever prosecuted. A coroner's jury declared the killings to be quote-unquote justifiable homicide. And the press mostly called it a labor riot or a communist riot. And ultimately 50 people were shot, of whom 10 later died. And 100 others were beaten with clubs. And those that died were shot in the back as they fled the police attack. Now let's go take a look at a documentary that was produced by the Illinois Labor History Society back in the 1950s as they're attempting to understand this massacre.
A view of the Millgate entrance at 118th and Burley, showing evidently some police, some scabs, some company personnel in the background. General view of the South Chicago plant of Republic Steel Corporation. And some of our pickets marching in front of the plant gate. A very limited number, as you can see.
Sam, that's such a shocking film. There must have been a real public outcry of it.
There was, but at the same time, this film that you've just seen was suppressed by the police. The public press, that is the newspapers, tended to support the Chicago police. They looked upon it as a demonstration that warranted the bloodshed by the Chicago police. However, we had some similar incidents on the evening of the 26th and the 28th of May at the Republic Steel plant in South Chicago, where, again, our pickets had been beaten by police billy clubs, and we were anticipating that they might do that same thing today. That's the reason, for example, you saw in there some of the cars with a Red Cross sign on it were there to help carry any injured who may have been beaten. However, none of them really anticipated any serious incident or any shooting as took place. Consequently, the whole thing was a real tragedy. When the police had their grand jury investigation by the coroner's committee, they marked it down as justifiable homicide. The police alleged that our members were under the influence of marijuana, and that because they had marched across the field that day chanting CIO, CIO, that this was an indication that they were under the influence of dope.
This film shows so much police brutality, it's hard to believe that it would occur like this there before your eyes.
Yes, I think if you examine the film very carefully as it's being shown, you can see many of the police with drawn guns firing. You can see the strikers running away from the police line, trying to avoid being injured or hit by the police.
Tell me something about the people who were killed. Were they Republic Steel strikers?
Well, it's interesting, Les, to remember that of the 10 that were killed, there was Leo Francisco, a Mexican, Anthony Taglieri, an Italian, Lee Tisdale, a black, Joe Rothman, who was born in Bavaria in Germany, Sam Popovich, I assume, is a Croatian, Alfred Causey, who came from Alabama, Kenneth Reed, a farm boy from Iowa. There were 30 other victims of gunshot wounds, and there were 60 others who were clubbed or beaten.
Well, you mentioned that lady from Hull House.
Yes.
What was her testimony again that...
Miss Marshall, Lupe Marshall, testified that when she was thrown into the paddy wagon and to be hauled to the police station, that they were normally you accommodate 8 passengers in the paddy wagon. She counted 16. Many of them were thrown in on the floor between the seats, and they were piled on top of each other, wounded, bleeding. And she testified before the Senate Investigating Committee that One of them, down at the bottom of the pile, who was very visibly in very bad condition, asked for a cigarette. She lit a cigarette and put it in his mouth. It fell out of his mouth. "Thank you, that's all right," he said. And she said his eyes glazed and she could tell that he was dying right then and there.
Well, you said that the film was suppressed. What do you mean by that?
It was suppressed by the police. The Senate Investigating Committee had to subpoena it in order to have it appear before the La Follette Committee, who conducted an investigation of the Memorial Day incident.
Well, then this really must have been prime evidence in that hearing.
It was, and the Senate Committee also indicated very clearly that the long white clubs that were used by the police, the tear gas that was used by the police, evidently had to come from the properties of Republic Steel Corporation.
How did they get to that conclusion?
There was no tear gas issued by the regular police department that day, and anyone can see very clearly that these were not regulation police billy clubs. As a matter of fact, the police had been housed, fed, clothed, and billeted inside the plant gates by the Republic Steel Company, and the police had been there even before the strike had begun.
What about the strike itself?
Well, we, for all practical results, lost the strike, and it took us 4 or 5 years before we achieved our first collective bargaining agreement with the little steel companies.
So you did make a comeback.
Oh, we did make a comeback. We did not stop fighting. We fought to maintain the union and to conduct local union meetings and continue to organize and to use all of the available legal means that were present to finally vindicate the position of the right of the American working men and women to have a legitimate, bona fide trade union of their own choosing. Our union wasn't handed to us on a silver platter. We had to fight for it every inch of the way. That there were a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that went into the building of this organization. And that as long as we have laws that govern the relationship between the employer and the members of the union, we must constantly be on the alert to protect those rights. The right of freedom to speech, freedom of assembly, the right to peacefully picket. And there's one adage we should always remember: those who forget the past are destined to relive it.
All right, welcome students to the folks who brought us the weekend. Of course, here we are working on the weekend, but nonetheless, we're losing our weekends, but welcome. A Mexican, an Italian, a black, a Bavarian, a Croatian, an Alabaman, a Southerner, a Midwestern farmer. They died in that massacre. They died so that we might have it a little bit better today. An 8-hour day, can you imagine that? Overtime pay, can you imagine that? Social Security, can you imagine that? Workers' compensation. They died so that we could have a little bit better life. They died so that we could have a weekend. We must honor them. That is the 1937 Memorial Day Massacre. Now, they fought for something larger than themselves, and there's a woman that's very important, an immigrant woman. Her name is Luisa Moreno. She was a leader in the United States labor movement. She was a social activist, and she was a Guatemalan. She unionized workers, led strikes, wrote pamphlets in English and Spanish, convened the 1939 Congreso de Pueblos de Habla Española, which was the first national Latino civil rights assembly. Before she was voluntarily returned to Guatemala in 1915 after being pressured by the House Un-American Activities Committee to leave this country. She will be deported. As the Great Depression struck in 1929, and in order to support her daughter and unemployed husband, Moreno worked as a seamstress in Spanish Harlem. She organized her co-workers, most of whom were Latinas, into a garment workers' union. And in 1935, Moreno was hired by the American Federation of Labor as a professional organizer. She left her abusive husband and settled with her daughter in Florida, where she unionized African American and Latina cigar workers, cigar rollers. And she joined the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and she became a representative of what was known as UCAPAWA, the United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers of America. She became the editor of its Spanish-language newspaper in 1940. So as a Ucapawa representative, she helped organize workers at pecan shelling plants in San Antonio, Texas, and at cannery workers here in Los Angeles. There she encouraged alliances between between workers at different plants. And her leadership was the type that empowered other workers, especially women, and she strongly encouraged women to take leadership roles in union organizations. And during the 1950s, under the second Red Scare known as McCarthyism, Luisa Moreno will be deported to Guatemala for being, quote unquote, a communist sympathizer. And then there's another woman who put her life on the line larger than herself because she was involved in her community and wanted her community to have social justice and economic equality. And her name was Emma Tenayuca. She was a labor organizer to farm workers in San Antonio, Texas in the 1930s and beyond, and she led Mexican workers' movements in Texas. Tenayuca's first knowledge of the struggle of working people came from visits as a young child to what was known as the Plaza del Zacate in San Antonio. This was a place where socialists and anarchists would come to speak and work with families with grievances. And she was an integral part of the historical struggle to incorporate Mexican workers into progressive U.S. trade unions at a time when the overwhelming majority of Mexican workers were employed in low-paying, low-status sectors of the economy. And Tenayuca was also instrumental in one of the most famous conflicts of Texas labor history, the 1938 strike at the Southern Pecan Shelling Company. And during the strike, thousands of workers at over 130 plants protested a wage reduction of 1 cent per pound of shelled pecans. Mexicana and Chicana workers who picketed were gassed, arrested, and jailed. And the strike ended after 37 days when the city pecan growers agreed to arbitration. And in October that year, the National Labor Relations Act raised wages to 25 cents an hour. Thousands lost their jobs the following years as operators decided to mechanize plants in the face of rising labor costs. But let's take a look at how the Chicano Studies Center at the University of Texas at San Antonio, especially the women of Mecha, honored her in this documentary.
On a hot August night in 1939, San Antonio experienced the worst civil unrest in its history. A mob of 5,000 people converged on the municipal auditorium. Their purpose was to attack a group of Communist Party members meeting inside. But the focus of their anger was a slender young labor organizer and Communist Party leader named Emma Tenayuca. When they couldn't find her, they turned their anger on the seats and the windows and whatever else they could destroy. And in the days that followed, they frequently threatened to kill her. The woman who aroused such passions was raised on the west side of San Antonio by her grandparents. Her grandfather taught her to fish in the San Antonio River.
She was one of 11 children. She and her younger sister, Maya and Carrie, went to live with the grandparents, her maternal grandparents. And I know that her grandfather really nurtured her. He really nurtured her intellect. I think they would curl up in a chair and read the newspaper and, you know, look at the pictures and talk about what was going on, things like that.
On trips to the Plaza del Zacate, now known as Milam Square, Emma's grandfather introduced her to the intoxicating world of political ideology. By the time she was 15, Emma was reading works by Karl Marx and such intellectuals of the Mexican Revolution as the Flores Magón brothers. By the time she was 17, she had been jailed for walking the picket line with workers striking against the Fink Cigar Company. By the time she was 21, Emma Tenayuca was known throughout San Antonio for her passionate support of better wages and working conditions for the city's laborers. She was a gifted orator and skilled union organizer, and her name was becoming anathema to the political establishment. All the elements were in place for her greatest confrontation. Since the late 19th century, pecan shelling had become one of San Antonio's major industries. 25% of the nation's pecans were processed here, mostly by Hispanic women working in sweatshop conditions at near starvation wages. In January 1938, the shelling companies dropped their payments for a pound of shelled pecan meat from 7 cents to 6 cents. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. 12,000 pecan shellers went on strike. They asked Emma Tenayuca to lead them. Emma was everywhere, writing pamphlets, walking picket lines, giving fiery speeches. But soon, the power structure of the city, spearheaded by the police, descended on the strikers. Hundreds were arrested. Dozens were jailed, including Emma. The strike continued for months, and the strikers eventually won back their original pay. More importantly, they proved that workers had some power.
But I think that she felt that she made a difference with the pecan sheller strike. She spoke of it as a beginning because I think what it did is it gave people hope, and it gave people the knowledge that they could make a difference.
After the strike was settled, Emma continued her efforts for the poor and the unemployed. But her affiliation with the Communist Party set up another confrontation. The one that left her running from a hysterical mob at the municipal auditorium. In a move that cost him his political career, Mayor Maury Maverick allowed the local communists to meet in the municipal auditorium. Maverick felt it was a free speech issue. Unfortunately, some disgruntled citizens didn't see it that way, which is why Emma and other party members had to be hurriedly led to a safety under police escort. After that night, Emma adopted a lower profile. For the next 10 years, she continued to promote workers' rights, but she herself was forced out of the workplace. Shunned by San Antonio's business community, she could not find employment. In 1948, seeking a quieter life and a chance to earn a living, Emma left for California. She would not return for 20 years. When Emma once again took up residence in her native city, she hoped only to enjoy her extended family and settle into a quiet role as a public school teacher. Instead, she found herself honored as a pioneer Chicana, a Hispanic woman who had been ahead of her time as a feminist and civil rights activist. In 1981, she was included in an exhibit of notable Texas women at the Institute of Texan Cultures. In 1986, her achievements were recognized by the San Antonio Women's Hall of Fame, by Our Lady of the Lake University, and by St. Mary's University. In 1990, she appeared on the poster for the National Women's History Month. "You know, there were times when I thought I might be lynched," said Emma, "but I never thought I would be honored."
There was kind of a debt of gratitude among her contemporaries. By that time, the 80s and 90s, we had, thank God, we had minimum wage, we had fair labor standards, we had Social Security, we had food stamps, things like that. So there was a recognition that, yes, we don't let our citizens starve to death. We take care of the workers, our citizens. And so they realized she was really ahead of her time because that's what she was fighting for way back so many years ago.
In a cruel twist of fate, Emma's brilliant mind succumbed to Alzheimer's disease. She died in 1999. But the world she left behind was changed, and Emma Tenayuca had helped change it.
So again, who are these dangerous people? These socialists, these communists, these Reds, these anarchists, these people who just don't seem to get it right that we live in a place that's capitalism. Who are these peoples? These peoples are the ones that are very instrumental in giving us the rights that we so take for granted today in our generation. The right, what this generation left us, an 8-hour day, overtime pay. They brought us the weekend. They got us Social Security. They got us aids to families with dependent children. These peoples put their lives on the line for us. They were immigrants. They were children of immigrants. They come from all the different directions of white, black, yellow, red beans, the green beans. So let's appreciate this generation, students. Again, they were involved in political democracy, and they called not just for political democracy, but also economic democracy, social equality, and an interracial and gender discrimination. So for black people, the New Deal was psychologically encouraging, yet most blacks, along with Mexicans and Asians, were ignored by the New Deal programs. And as tenant farmers, as farm laborers, as migrants, as domestic workers, people of color did not qualify for unemployment insurance, minimum wages, Social Security, or farm subsidies. Roosevelt was careful not to offend Southern white politicians whose political support he needed, so he didn't push for a bill against lynching. So blacks, Mexicans, Asians, and whites were segregated in the armed forces, and black workers were discriminated against in getting jobs. People who were of color were the last hired and the first fired. So in the 1930s, it was a struggle by people of color to gain admission into both unions as well as larger society, the institutions of larger society. Then there's this one man named A. Philip Randolph. He was the head of the Sleeping Car Porters Union, a socialist. He threatened a massive march on Washington in 1941. And only when Roosevelt agreed to sign an executive order establishing a Fair Employment Practices Committee was the march called off. Now, the Fair Employment Practices Committee laid the foundation for the civil rights movement that would emerge a few years later. So let's go to a brief bio on A. Philip Randolph and appreciate his importance to the black community.
I think one of the individuals that in some ways encapsulates as much of the full range of political organizing in Harlem over many decades of the 20th century would be A. Philip Randolph. Here's a man who comes into the fullness of his calling first as a socialist. He is the co-editor of a magazine called The Messenger, advocating for taking down capitalism as really the only true road to racial equality, which eventually leads him to union organizing. And so he founds the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids. The and maids gets dropped off over time, but initially it really was a mass labor movement organized around increasing wages and benefits for black porters and maids on Pullman cars, which traveled all around the country. A. Philip Randolph also is the broker of the March on Washington movement, which is a threat posed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt to integrate the defense industries that were taking advantage of black migrants coming out of the South in response to the opportunities of World War II. And so with the threat of 100,000 black people marching on Washington in 1941, Franklin Delano Roosevelt preemptively signs Executive Order 8802, the Fair Employment Practices Commission. Randolph eventually supports Martin Luther King, the young Baptist preacher in the mid-1950s, and ultimately leads to being the lead planner of the March on Washington in 1963. A. Philip Randolph even lived long enough to witness the influence of Malcolm X on this community. So if you just take A. Philip Randolph, that one life rooted here in this community, in all the different philosophies and ideological approaches that he took in trying to move the needle on civil rights in this country, you get a wonderful sense of the richness of ideas that were in circulation.
All right, so A. Philip Randolph, he's going to finally realize his dream of the March on Washington in 1963. It's going to catapult Martin Luther King into prominence. But again, let's appreciate this generation. And what is important for us is how the Committee of Industrial Organizations became the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Now, the CIO was born out of a fundamental dispute within the U.S. labor movement over whether and how to organize immigrant workers. And those who favored craft unionisms believed that the most effective way to represent workers was to defend the advantages that they had secured through their skills. Craft unionists were opposed to organizing workers on an industrial basis. So let's appreciate again the American Federation of Labor leadership treated the CIO, the Committee on Industrial Organizations, as an enemy from the outset, refusing to deal with it and demanding that it dissolve. And primarily is because the CIO reached out to the immigrant. The CIO reached out to the industrial worker, the unskilled worker. The FFL's opposition to the CIO, however, only increased the stature of the CIO and John Lewis of the United Mine Workers in the eyes of those industrial workers who were keen on organizing and were disillusioned by the American Federation of Labor's ineffective performance. Now, Lewis continued to denounce the AFL's policies while the CIO offered organizing support to workers in the rubber industry who went out on strike and formed the Steelworkers Organizing Committee. And they did that in defiance of all of the craft divisions that the AFL had required in past organizing efforts in 1936. So, students, the first major industrial revolution to be chartered by the CIO on November 16, 1938, was the United Electrical, Radio, and Machine Workers of America, also called the UE. And the UE today is one of the most important and strongest unions in the telecommunications industry. The subsequent explosive growth of the UE was instrumental for the survival in the early days of the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Then the sit-down strikes and the Memorial Day massacres led to the popularity of the CIO. But the CIO was very, very important because it represented previously excluded groups. Now people of color and women are going to join en masse. Blacks, immigrants, Mexicans, and women. So, without the rank and file disruption and the eventual organizing tactics institutionalized by the CIO, we would not have what is known as the Fair Labor Standards Act today. And the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 is a federal statute of the United States. And the Fair Labor Standards Act established a national minimum wage. It guaranteed time and a half for overtime in certain jobs, and it prohibited most employment of minors in oppressive child labor. This was a term that is defined in the statute. And it applies to employees that are employees who are engaged in interstate commerce or are employed by an enterprise engaged in commerce or in the production of goods for commerce, unless the employer can claim an exemption from coverage. But basically what the Fair Labor Standards Act, the ultimate message to the working American, to the immigrant worker, to the first generation of immigrants, the ultimate message is it's not your fault that you are poor. But on May 26, 1938, a committee is going to be formed. It was established as a special investigating committee. It will be known as the House Committee on Un-American Activities. It was reorganized from its previous incarnations as the Fish Committee and the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, but it was designed, the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, to investigate allegedly disloyalty and subversive activities on the part of private citizens, public employees, and those organizations suspected of having communist or fascist ties. And this committee is very important because it was in response to events that were occurring in Europe. And the committee would work for the next 20 years to undermine the organizing activities of union leaders, of immigrants, of workers, of immigrant workers, and they would work to deport some American citizens whose loyalty was called into question. This particular committee eventually is going to influence the passage of what will be known as the Smith Act of 1940. And the committee's importance was reinforced by the passage of the Smith Act. And the Alien Registration Act, or Smith Act of 1940, is a United States federal statute that set criminal penalties for advocating the overthrow of the U.S. government and required all non-citizen adult residents to register with the government. The act is best known for its use against political organizations and figures, with approximately 215 Americans indicted under the terms of the legislation, including alleged communists, Trotskyists, and fascists. Luisa Moreno, whom we just covered previously, as an immigrant Guatemalan woman, worker, she will be deported under the provisions of this act. So, students, I have shared with you that this particular presentation would cover the Bracero program and into World War II. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and save World War II so that I don't rush through it in the next presentation. I will just call this presentation the Great Depression and the 1930s, and we'll leave it with that. And I'd like to end this particular session, and next week we will pick up with the Bracero program and World War II. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.